Hi everybody, my name is Hannah and this is Pepper and Pine, and I have an anatomy lesson to share with you today. We're working through this book called Muscles and Bones, and we're on the chapter on skin and care of skin. And while this was supposed to be 2 lessons into 1, it's turned into 2 lessons into 3. And so we're working on the second of 3 parts of this lesson today. And we're going to be doing an illustration of the human skin and then talking a little bit more in detail about the different aspects of the skin. But primarily, the bulk of the lesson is going to be the illustration that we're doing for this lesson. And I am using this book called The Human Body Atlas for information about the skin, as well as a little bit with this illustration. But primarily, we're going to be using this book by Welcome to the Museum series, the anatomy book. We're going to be using this illustration as inspiration for our illustration in our main lesson book. We're going to be slipping this book underneath the onion skin, tracing it, and then illustrating it afterwards. And we're going to be using some of the content in this book for the content in our lesson, but primarily it's going to be a big illustration with the illustration labeled and then a little bit more information about the labeling for this illustration. So this is the second in a series of 3 lessons on the skin, the dermis, the epidermis. We are going to be working in our main lesson books. These are available at A Child's Dream. These ones measure 9.5 inches by 12 inches, and the pages are separated by an onion skin, which comes in really handy for this particular lesson, since I find that it would be really challenging to do that illustration without being able to copy it, and by copying it, tracing it literally. However, I did find that the illustration is a little bit too detailed for what we need, and so by me doing it first allows my daughter to do a simplified version of that illustration because she's not going to need quite that much detail, and it did take a lot more time than we expected. We also have our Lyra color pencils. We're going to be using these primarily for this illustration, along with the Lyra color pencils that are a little bit thicker, that are the skin tones. I'm using the onion skin for this lesson by slipping the book with the illustration underneath the onion skin. And I had to sort of keep it in place a little bit by pressing down on the book because I wanted to make sure that I didn't shift the book or the onion skin while I was tracing. This ended up being far more intense than I expected, and I did have to raise my lights as high as they would go so that I could see through the onion skin because it's not technically tracing paper, so it did take a little bit more effort in order to trace it. Now, I really love the way it looks in the end, but this was far too complicated as an in-between lesson that we're doing for our skin, dermis, and epidermis, because I had intended 2 chapters in our book to be 1 lesson, and now those 2 chapters are becoming 3 lessons. And while I really love this lesson and I love the outcome, I feel that it was too intense, too complicated, and too detailed for our purposes for this particular main lesson block. If this was the only lesson you were doing on skin, I would say that would be fine. Take your time, really dive into it, but this makes the second out of 3 illustrations that are going to be fairly time consuming. The last one that we're going to do on this adjoining page, which is the palm of our hand, ends up not taking very long and honestly doesn't end up looking that great in the end compared to the previous lesson that we did with the back of our hand. For this illustration, I'm only doing maybe a quarter of the actual illustration that you can see in the book. And in the book, this illustration spans 2 very large pages. And within the illustration, there are multiples of the same thing. So you're going to see multiple hair roots as well as blood vessels, but I only just need 1 of each of those things for this illustration. So it's nearly complete, and I'm adding just a little bit more that's in a different illustration so that I can label that as well. And now I'm getting my Lyra color pencils, and I'm using mostly the colors that would represent this particular illustration, but I am also referring to another illustration, and the colors used in that illustration are fairly different. They're a lot more warm toned, a lot more yellow, but I actually like the way this one looks, and so I'm going to stay with more of a muted color palette so that the blue is a little bit more muted and the reds are a little bit more have a little bit more purple or pink or gray in them. And I do like the way this turns out, but depending on the illustration that you're looking at, the colors are going to be different, even though the structures are going to be fairly similar. Now at this point, I have to figure out what I traced and what colors go where, and for the most part, it goes pretty well. There are a couple of spots that after a little bit of trial and error, I realized were not the right color for the right space. I really don't like the blue that I first laid down, so I'm looking for some other colors that I can lay on top of that blue just to make it a little bit more muted. I find that having a light gray and a dark gray really help if you want to have more muted tones with your color pencils, but it took a little while to figure out what color to add on top of that blue, and then I finally just chose a different blue for those blood vessels. For this lesson, I'm also adding 2 layers that are a little bit harder to see in this illustration, even though I believe they are talked about in the content of this book. But I also wanted to add the fascia that's underneath, even though in retrospect, I realized that that's probably not something that I need my daughter to draw, because when we were done with this illustration, actually when I was done and then presenting it to her so that she could copy from the illustration, and I told her, I don't want you to copy everything. Actually, let's just talk about the things that we can feel or sense or see, and let's just add those into our illustration, because this is quite an abstract drawing if you are not understanding where this is on your body. This is really beautiful. This is very educational, but it feels disconnected from your actual body if you're not understanding what you're actually looking at and feeling and experiencing in real life with your skin or with any other part of your body if you're studying anatomy. And this would not be a time to do dissection, in my opinion, because I feel like that's even a greater disconnect from your own body and how it functions, since dissection is done on things that are no longer living, and we are trying to concentrate on things that are living and the living body and the functions of our body when it is alive. So we talked about our skin and what we feel on our skin. So we can feel and see the dead skin, because that is the final layer. That's your epidermis. It is like the outermost layer of your skin. And we can actually see and feel the dermis on occasion, because the book goes into details of what happens when you get a cut or a wound and the new skin is growing. And that new skin is quite tender and new and a little bit of a lighter color than the rest of your skin. So we talked about the epidermis and the dermis. Of course, you can see the hair and the hair follicles. And since we can perceive senses with our fingers and our skin, we opted to illustrate the sense receptors as well. And since we can sense when we are sweating, then we opted to also do the sweat glands as well. So only the things that we could experience or see were the things that I wanted to have her illustrate, rather than just do the entire illustration the way that it was. Next, we're going to label everything and add a little bit more detail about what this illustration portrays. And we're going to continue this content on to the next page with the illustration of our palm. So I really like that this particular book talked about the different sense receptors and what they're each responsible for. And this was insightful in understanding what our skin does for us, because we tend to think about our sensory organs as our eyes and our ears as taking in the most crucial information for our well-being and for our safety. But when we explored what the dermis and the epidermis can do, then it gave us a new appreciation and a more profound appreciation for what our skin is capable of doing and what it does to protect us from extreme heat, extreme cold, from pressure, from pain. And so we're going to include a lot more of those details on the adjoining page for the lesson that's coming up next. I hope that you enjoyed this look at our Waldorf-inspired anatomy lesson for the dermis and the epidermis. I hope that you'll check out the blog post that accompanies this video for more information on this lesson, as well as all of the resources we used for our anatomy main lesson block. You can find the link to that blog post in the description box below. And if you'd like to see how we're homeschooling on a daily basis, you can find me on Instagram and now on TikTok at Pepper and Pine.